Jesus talks about a woman, submit yourself to your husband. And the girls go, ah! But then he says, husbands, love your wife like Christ loved the church. Now, if you're going to lay down your life as a husband, then I'm not sure I would ever meet any wife that wouldn't want to submit herself to that mission.
G'day everyone and welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makiewicz and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Kevin Bailey. Kevin is a father of 7 children and has had a full life where he's been part of the Army, a financial advisor and a philanthropist among many other roles. Kevin, welcome to the channel.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
So Kevin, you started your working life pretty young. You joined the Army at 16, I believe. Yeah. Can you tell us more about your military career, which has some very interesting twists and turns inside of it?
Sure. Look, I grew up in Sydney and my friends in Melbourne, so that explains a lot. But nevertheless, I've lived in Melbourne, virtually for the last 48 years or so. I haven't been back in Sydney, but we grew up in a 2-bedroom housing commission house, government housing, and we had 2 bedrooms and 8 kids. And so it ended up being myself and a couple of brothers sleeping out in the garage and the other kids sharing and mum and dad. And dad was worked in a factory and, basically putting food on the table was the name of the game. And I had to leave school at the end of year 10. And I wanted to go on and further my education, but there was no way known that we could afford to do that. So I joined the Army at 16 and studied. I got selected for a course in electronics for 4 years at the Army Apprentices School in Victoria. So that's where I left home, left Sydney and came down to Victoria here. The colonel of our regiment was in charge of the Army ski team. And so he was very keen to establish a biathlon skiing team with the soldiers that were at the unit. And I was an excellent cross-country runner and, as it turned out, I was a pretty good marksman. So they looked for volunteers to join the ski team. And so I volunteered. I loved it. And every weekend and a couple of weeks in August, we'd go up to the mountains. They had coaches and Army cooks and drivers and all the backup to help us to train and to race, and they introduced biathlon skiing into Australia in 1976. I was one of the first skiers. At the end of 1978, I won the Australian Junior Championships and qualified to go to the World Cup and World Championships in Europe, and then went to the pre-Olympic Games in Lake Placid in the United States a year before the 1980 Winter Olympics. This was in 1979. And I was in the running. They were looking to get me involved, and I was looking to be qualified to go in the Winter Olympics in 1980. And I had a motorbike accident. And as a result of the motorbike accident, I had ended up spending 5 months in hospital and missed out on the Olympics. The Traffic Accident Commission thought they went through a whole process, and it took a year or more before they heard the case. And of course, the lawyers asked, what was I doing a year later? I was supposed to be in, wheelchair and broken arms and in a terrible state. But I decided that to get myself out of that, I was going to apply for the SAS, the Special Forces. So by the time the case came around, I didn't get anywhere near the payout I would have liked to have gotten because I had to tell them that I was trying out for the SAS. So it wasn't the smartest. I wasn't the smartest kid on the block, but nevertheless, I got a payout of about $13,000, which in 1981 was a lot of money. You could buy a new Holden car for about $8,000 back in those days. So I then invested that money, and meanwhile I was in the SAS and did all their, got through all their selection courses and and did all of that. And then I was very interested in a whole lot of the operations over there. Wasn't so interested in electronics anymore. Didn't want to go on and further my studies there for electronics engineering course at RMIT. Normally, after a few years, they send you off for a year to complete things to get your degree in that area. But I went and joined the counter-terrorism unit, which they had established in the early 80s. After the Amanda Marga bombings in 1978, the Australian government decided to set up a counter-terrorist unit. After the Iranian embassy siege in London, about 80-81, they established the unit over in the West. And Jim Wallace, who was quite well known now for the Australian Christian lobby, he was the officer commanding the counter-terrorist unit, and I worked with him, and he would invite me back on Wednesday nights to his home. He and his wife Poppy, who was a doctor, they had two very little children. We're talking over 40 years ago. Those very little children are now much older, but nevertheless, I went to a Bible study with Jim and Poppy Wallace, and I was quite involved in that. I was involved in a youth group called Antioch that I got very, very passionately involved in, and it was a huge movement that was, young people that were getting involved with other young people and bringing people to faith. And so those early years in the 80s were fantastic time that I spent about 5 or 6 years over in Western Australia. And I was continued to invest money, got very, very interested in the share market and investment, in how money would make money. Back in the early 80s, Australia had gotten rid of exchange controls, so you could invest in Japan and America. And in the booming 80s, I was having a lot of fun. I was making more money with my investments than I was making by working for the Army with my Army pay. And so then I was offered a position with the company that I was investing through back in those days. And so I started a new career. After 1986, I got involved in the investment game and was involved in that for nearly 30 years.
So you got into the game in 86, and then 87, wasn't there a financial crash?
There certainly was, 19th of October, 1987. And timing is everything. So it was very interesting. In fact, the guy who was in charge of the Melbourne operation died, took his own life, and they needed someone to come over as the manager in Victoria. So I was asked if I would take on the role, and I had to make the decision within 24 hours because they desperately needed someone over in Victoria. And so that's what, I made the decision. It was good for my career. It was good to be close to the snow again. And there was a young girl over here in Victoria that I was very keen to get to know, who's now my wife of over 35 years. And so that's what brought me here, and I've never left.
Now you founded a successful financial advisory business, I believe so.
Yeah.
You've also written a couple of books, and then you became known in the media. So you had radio spots and newspaper columns. Can you tell us a bit more about that side of your career?
Yeah, sure. What had happened was I was very concerned about the conflicts of interest that were happening within the planning profession and advice profession. And so I was concerned about the role of commissions, and they were introducing trailing commissions and all sorts of incentives, trips for people if they could recommend things. And so my sense was that we needed to actually be a fee-only profession. So I was one of the founding members of the Financial Planning Association, and I joined their board of the professional body, and I was a director there on the board for over 6 years. I got very involved in working to develop the degree courses for financial planning and education, and a whole range of the rules of professional conduct and the code of ethics. All those sorts of things were very close to my heart. So I set about trying to turn things around and getting very involved with the all the different players in the industry. and I ended up getting a life, basically becoming a fellow of the Financial Planning Association, and then I received the award of the Advisor of the Year. I left the company that I was with and started my own practice and business, and I grew that over the course of from 1996 till about 2008, to where we had over 50 people working in the firm. I merged with a number of other businesses around the country, about 13 other businesses. We listed on the stock exchange, and I'd become very involved in philanthropy. Back in the 90s, I was very concerned about the plight of the Timorese. In the Second World War, the Second Independent and the Second and the Second Fourth Independent companies were fighting against the Japanese just north of Darwin in Timor Leste. And so I met a number of the old diggers, the old soldiers who'd fought in the Second World War. We're talking, early 80s. And so, they were by this stage getting into their late 60s, 70s. And these guys were really quite horrified about the fact that in 1975, Australia had supported the Indonesians invading Portuguese Timor and effectively taking over the small country. And then there was, I suppose, really it's a form of genocide. They killed a third of the population, and then they transferred a lot of migrants from Java to go and live in Timor. And the Timorese were in a terrible situation. And these old soldiers talked about how they owed their lives. There were 385 Australian commando soldiers who fought there in the Second World War, and 20,000 Timorese lost their lives defending 385 Aussies. So I had a real sense that we owed them a debt of honour. In 1991, I saw the Santa Cruz massacre on television, where there were 290 young people were killed in cold blood by the Indonesian military. And I made a decision that I had to do something to help them. And so I got very involved with politicians, with trying to lobby government and media, trying to get the voice of the Timorese heard. In 1996, Jose Ramazotta and Bishop Ximenez Bello got the Nobel Peace Prize for the work they were doing for the Timorese. In 1999, they had a vote or a plebiscite where 89% of the population voted for independence, and then the Indonesian military just razed the entire country to the ground. The Australian SAS were the first troops on the ground from Australia with peacekeepers, my old regiment, my old mates, and it was really quite a wonderful opportunity for them to repay that debt that we owed the Timorese. And of course, General Peter Cosgrove, who went on to become the Governor General, was fantastic in the way that he was able to work with the Timorese. The leadership of the Timorese asked me if I would establish a consulate in Australia to represent them. So I became the Honorary Consul General for East Timor here in Australia, and I had all sorts of negotiations with the Australian government and the local state governments, and we set up a whole lot of relations with the Timorese. I got very involved in a lot of the charities that were going in there to try to help this country. It was the poorest country in Southeast Asia, the newest country, the first country of the new millennium, when they had their independence granted to them from the United Nations in 2002. And so I became very heavily involved, not only in running the consulate, but also in running and being on boards and getting involved in lots of philanthropy and third world. That led me to other areas of the third world, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and supporting, building schools, helping with water projects, all sorts of things. That became quite a passion. Meanwhile, the Timorese negotiated for the royalties from the Timor Sea gas that was offshore at the Bayu Undan, Corallina and Greater Sunrise fields. And so they were then getting royalty revenue, and they didn't know what to do with it. They were very concerned about the petroleum curse, that other countries that get lots of money very quickly causes a lot of inflation, a lot of wastage. So I assisted on the board with setting up their sovereign wealth fund. And ultimately, we employed lots of Timorese and trained them, and I did that for just over 10, 12 years, and we ended up managing about $16 billion on behalf of the Timorese. I ran their consulate. I was doing lots of the philanthropy work, and I was building a financial planning business. So I had lots of irons in the fire. But when we merged our business, listed on the stock exchange, I wanted to head up the philanthropy arm for the company, and then eventually I decided to leave and walk away from everything that I was involved in and get more involved in faith-based things. So I went from rooster to feather duster in one fell swoop. So it was an interesting time in about 2011, 2012.
Uh-huh. And I was just on the East Timorese issue. Now, Timor Gap that's where all the gas is, right?
Yes.
I'd never known much about it. So I was hoping you could explain a bit about how it's
Sure.
contested, because I'd heard that Australia had been exploitative in that situation. So if you could give us some background.
What happened was back in the 60s, Indonesia was a new country. They wanted to have their international waters recognised as an archipelago, where it wasn't just the 12-mile limit, but it was really right across all the thousands of islands in Indonesia, that it was all Indonesian territory. Australia was pushing to have the continental shelf argument, which was an old argument that your territorial waters extended to the edge of the continental shelf. And so what happened was they did a deal with the Indonesians in the late 60s to lobby the United Nations to give Indonesia their archipelago rights to all their underwater resources, their fishing and their gas and oil. And East Timor agreed that their border with Australia would extend to the edge of the continental shelf. What's interesting, though, is that the Portuguese said this is not a good deal. So there was a gap of about 144 miles, or I'm not sure miles or kilometres, but it's very small gap, 144 miles, a couple of hundred kilometres, that there was no border negotiated for that sea border between Portuguese Timor and Australia. Of course, Australia agreed to the Indonesians invading in 1975, a few years later, and then in the early 80s, Australia and Indonesia decided to close the gap, where 90% of all the oil and gas in that gap went to Australia and 10% to Indonesia. So, but what was interesting with that continental shelf argument is that subsequent to this, there's never ever been an agreement based on a continental shelf argument, as it's become more sophisticated in the 50 years since. And so it was a bit of an aberration when maritime law wasn't quite so well developed, and Australia was able to get this good deal. The interesting thing, though, is that the Wetar Strait is a 3-kilometre deep trench to the north on the Indonesian side of East Timor Island, not on the Australian side. And so, in fact, the continental shelf of Australia goes under the Asian plate, right at that Wetar Gap. That's why the nuclear submarines could go through there. And that's part of the reason why the Americans and the Australians didn't want to have a continental, they didn't want to have an independent Timor at the time, which could be a bit like Cuba is to America. So, if they felt that they could deal with Indonesia, the entire Indonesia, so they felt it was best that Indonesia take it over. But in fact, when you push up against the continental shelf, East Timor was a fold, and the Timor trough is like a bed sheet when you push it up. So we've got the same flora and fauna, the same rock formations in East Timor as you've got in the Northern Territory. So it's really, it doesn't hold any water to have the continental shelf argument, because that's all part of the Australian continental shelf. So they couldn't really argue it with this Timor Gap. So when East Timor got their independence, of course, they negotiated for a deal where they were looking to get a fair deal, and everything that's been negotiated since then has been the what they call the midway point, halfway between the two land masses, and all the oil and gas would be in East Timor's side. And so they ended up with a negotiation where there was Part A, Part B, and Part C. Part C was in the Australian side, Part A was in the Timorese side, and B was this part in the middle, which had all the oil and gas, but it was all on the Timorese side of the medial line. So there's lots and lots of negotiations. Eventually, Australia got what I think is probably more than our fair share. And they also negotiated that they decided that all of the gas should be taken off and shipped and piped to Darwin rather than to Timor-Leste. And so that's been an ongoing issue because of this trough that's between the two. But Timor's fighting very hard to get all the downstream work done in Timor so that they've got employment and all these other things. So this is, international bullying, and it's really Australia wanting to get more than their fair share. But it was interesting negotiations over the first decade of the 21st century. And so Timor's got a pretty reasonable deal, and they're getting the royalties on those parts that are on their side of the medial line. And Australia's getting some of it, which perhaps you could argue they shouldn't get any. But also it may eventuate that they ship it to East Timor, pipe the gas to East Timor rather than Australia. And so they've actually picked up $16 billion of royalty that they've got in their sovereign wealth fund. And that funds about 90% of their education and their schools and their hospitals and all their infrastructure. So it's really given them a bit of a head start and a bit of a boost.
What's their population, by the way?
Well, it was 600,000 when they were invaded in 1975. 200,000 were lost, about a third of the population. By 1999, because they're a good Catholic country, they have 7 or 8 kids each. And what happened was they ended up being around about that 400,000 grew to around about 900,000 a million. Now they're about 1.5 million in 2024. So it's a very tiny country. And they've got, they're looking to join ASEAN, but they've got a great future ahead of them. And so I'm really quite delighted with the way that, we were involved in putting a wrong right, and also seeing literally the birth of a nation, and working with the president, the foreign minister, and the prime minister, and the government minister for foreign affairs, with lots of the NGOs, lots of the church organisations, the Salesians and the Christian Brothers, Marist Brothers, Jesuits. There's been a whole host of people that have been involved in transforming that country, and they've got a long way to go, but they're a heck of a long way from where they were back in 1999, 2000.
Just taking us back a peg, you mentioned that you were concerned about kind of ethical violations, or at least ethical integrity in the financial sector before, and obviously it carries over into places like Timor getting a fair shake. I was wondering, in a globalized economy, everything's so intertwined now. What could you say to those who wish to invest ethically, but within a globalized economy?
Yeah, it's really interesting question you ask about ethical investments. It's all beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What do you define as ethical? If you're Alan Banth and you run the Greens Party, you would say that abortion and post-birth abortion would be ethical. If you're a Catholic, you'd probably say it's not ethical. If you're a genuine Catholic that practices and doesn't walk out on Joe de Bruyn when he's giving a lecture at Australian Catholic University. But the fact is there's a whole host of definitions of what's ethical. We've had a cultural Marxist type infiltration that's infiltrated our universities, our schools, our politics, our public service, our government institutions, and also our private boardrooms and HR people that are involved. So that effectively now you've got a group of people that like to call themselves the elites that decide what's ethical and what's not ethical. They decide what's information or disinformation or misinformation, and they put themselves up as the arbiters of what is ethical. So you have these DEI proponents and ESG, G proponents that effectively you've really got to question. We all want to be ethical. Who wants? No, I vote for being non-ethical. Even things like when we drink. I go to the restaurant and my wife gets very cross with me because the waiter always asks, "Would you like sparkling or still water?" And I said, "I'd like to have polluted water, please." And they go, "Oh, we don't have polluted water in this restaurant." But I'm just trying to be consistent because, carbon pollution is carbonated. And so carbonated water is polluted water. And so we need to be consistent so I'll drink polluted water, thanks, because it doesn't really hurt me that badly. And so what's happened is terrible bigot. Like we've now got a generation of young people who, you talk about, different people and then that's racist. No one wants to be racist, so we dodge and weave and but they manipulate our desire to be ethical, our desire not to be racist, our desire to be seen as virtuous. So we find this whole group of people that are, virtue signaling, and then of course, being a stale, pale, and male old white bloke, what on earth would I have to say about anything? And toxic masculinity. All these sorts of things that we're being manipulated. And the same thing goes for ethical investments. So often people think, I can't invest in this or that particular investment. I certainly wouldn't invest in gas in East Timor because that's unethical, because it's warming the planet and destroying our future. You couldn't possibly invest in, in companies that supported people not having abortions. So, there's so many complexities. And when you've got, money is fungible and shares in a company are fungible. If you don't buy some particular investment, someone else will. And so ultimately, what happens if people are genuinely unethical and doing the wrong thing? You have people that, arms suppliers, you can't possibly invest in that. But then, you look at the Israeli-Hamas situation. Is it unethical to sell arms to Israel to defend themselves against massive terrorism that's killing and murdering and raping all their population, will drive them into the sea? And they have this idea of from the river to the sea. Now, is it unethical for them to defend themselves? You see, the nuances are so great in relation to investment that it's such a simplistic attitude that people have that it makes it very difficult to know what's ethical or what's not ethical. And so ultimately, it's what you do with the gains that you make from investment that can make a real difference. Some people think mining for gold or for copper or for any of these sorts of things that we use in our everyday lives is unethical because using growing crops, or it really becomes incredibly complex. So I like to ask a lot of questions about people about what are they looking for, and they're looking for virtue signaling easy answers in a very simplistic sort of way that, and then they think, I'll just lend money for buy property because that way I can be ethical. But when the people can't pay their rent, do you throw them out on the street, or do you actually just keep letting them live in your house and getting no income from it when you've got to pay a mortgage that's doubled or tripled? And what's ethical there to the landowner or the person who's saved all their life to actually provide for their retirement, or is it the person who's renting their house and not paying their rent? I'm just asking questions. I'm not giving you any answers. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, I totally understand that, and it's a good point you make, because people go, "Oh, well, this company uses African slave labor to mine its minerals."
Yes,
and so people think along those lines. But then you're right.
That's an easy one, isn't it?
There's so many things that would destroy economies if you didn't invest in it, and all in the name of your virtue signaling, and then everyone ends up without the lights on. So
yeah. And it's a way that, once again, this cultural Marxism has infiltrated our society, and they've actually tapped into the goodness in our people and the desire to be good, the desire to do the right thing. But they've actually recognised there's a laziness to follow through and to research things properly and to really understand the nuances. And so they get away with conning us. So often they just they basically make us feel guilty for all sorts of things, and ultimately it's just weakening the Judeo-Christian Western society and undermining us and allowing the dictatorial governments like North Korea and Iran and China and Russia to get more and more powerful and to basically dominate and weakening us constantly, to the point where a lot of young people, when you ask them, they wouldn't even stay and defend their country. They'd just basically hand over to whoever wants to take over because they don't think there's anything worth defending. And so we've got to stop. Playing into their hands and start thinking to a much greater degree. Someone like Jordan Peterson really sort of is a very good thinker and really gets people to question, lots of things that we've never really been able to do to the same degree. And so, of course, he gets cancelled then, and then has to go to do remedial training because of, the questions that he asks, because he doesn't take the glib answers that are just dished out.
Yeah. He's appreciated, I think, because especially you see the draw with young men, and it's because he's actually talking about something substantial and tackling real questions and trying to supply meaningful answers,
which is indicative of himself.
Yeah, they've been fed on sand their entire lives, and they're thirsting for some water. So indeed.
They've been mushrooms, you see. They've been kept in the dark and fed on bullshit. Is that allowed to be said on this podcast? I'm not sure.
It can be. There's not too many young kids, apart from perhaps my own, that listen. So yeah. So you mentioned about 2010, 2011, you started to get, you left the financial side of things and went more into philanthropy.
Yeah.
Wondering if you could give us a bit more of the backstory on your faith. So, I mean, you went to a Bible study with Jim Wallace back in the 80s.
You're early 80s, 40 years ago.
A child of, you got 7 siblings yourself.
Yes.
You've got a big family. So there's a sense of there's a streak of Christianity running through you, but then it got more serious for you. So could you just walk us through that?
I think, what had happened was I was very involved in the Antioch youth group in the early 80s and in my teenage years. And, anyone who really wants to follow Jesus, should I go into the priesthood? What should I do? How do I live my faith? That struggle with the faith. But I grew up in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, at a time where there was massive apostasy as people, were leaving the faith in droves. And so you had to be serious about your faith, to keep practicing when the vast majority of others were just throwing in the towel. And we had a lack of leadership. We didn't stand up for what we believed in, and we sort of got the world we deserve. My wife Grace, that she had a beautiful faith, and her family, and so she supported me, and I supported her in our faith. We practiced our faith. We got involved in running marriage preparation courses. We got involved in archdiocesan group for marriage and the family. We went along to conferences for family and marriage. Christopher West started coming to Australia in the early 90s, and we followed him. Grace's cousins and her uncle and aunt, they were very involved in the faith in Sydney, the Parolas, and so we kept involved in our faith. We got all of our kids baptized. We got married in the church. We got all the kids baptized. It was part of our life. But when my eldest son got to the point where no one at his school was going to church, 98% of kids go through the Catholic education system, finish their year 12, not going to mass, not practicing their faith. And that is a damning indictment. My son, another one of my sons, was a teacher in the Catholic school system. He was the only one that was going to mass out of the entire faculty that was practicing his faith. What we've got is a situation where we've basically dropped our standards, and we thought, oh, well, we can't find anyone who practice the faith. We'll just employ anyone. Lots of people in Catholic hospitals, nurses, doctors, people, not all of them practice their faith, and so we've just become an NGO like any other NGO, non-government organisation, providing education, hospitals, and even some of the people who work in a lot of our care for the homeless and some of these places, some of them are just really nice people. They're not doing it for the reason that Mother Teresa was doing it, because she saw Jesus in every single person she was tending to. When someone saw her taking maggots out of a dying man's wounds, and he said, I wouldn't do that for $1 million. And she said, never would I, but I do it for Jesus.
Uh-huh.
And so, that is what we have to get back to. We have to surrender our life. Jesus gave up everything. And so we have to surrender our life to find our life, to find ourselves. So my son was seeing that the school system wasn't really doing much. People who were at in our parish, in a very well-to-do suburb, weren't really. They were going through the motions, and he just thought, well, this is all bland, beige, hopeless. What is the point? And as a 16-year-old, it's uncool. And as a 16-year-old, even though it meant a lot to me, I wasn't showing it. And so I think it's a bit like I like using food analogies, but it was like he saw, if you go into a restaurant for a steak dinner, you can actually order mushrooms or potatoes or peas or beans or carrots or different sauces. They're all side optional things that you can have for your meal. And I think to his eyes, he saw what I was doing with my faith was just an optional extra. He wanted to be just like me. He wanted to follow in my footsteps. He wanted to be successful. He wanted to be able to, be someone who could really stretch himself. But he saw that my career as my steak dinner. And for a lot of people who go to church, they live in the world and go to church instead of living in the church and going to the world to convert the world. And so, if I'm honest with myself, I think I was doing that. It was important for me to be somebody, to be a contender, to be on the board of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, to be the Consul General for East Timor, to be on committees and giving expert witness advice in court cases and flying all over the world as an expert speaker, doing lots of big, glorious things and going to church on Sunday. And involved in running some marriage preparation courses or giving a little bit to these different charities and supporting aid and development and third world poverty and but doing all these sorts of things. But lots of people can do those things without believing in Jesus. And so he basically decided he wasn't going to go to church anymore, and so he ran up against a brick wall. And I'm saying, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And my wife was getting very concerned about the clash that we were having. And one night we had some friends around for dinner, and they started the conversation. All of them had kids the same age as my son, and they were talking about what they were going to do when they finished their high school, what they were going to go into medicine or go into business or go into law. And as they shared about their hopes and aspirations for their kids, I started formulating my response, thinking, oh, he wants to go into investment and planning and money management, and just like his father, And then before I could open my mouth, my wife spoke up and she just blurted out, I don't care if he's a garbage collector as long as I get to spend eternity with him. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew that, when I looked at her, and the pain that she had in her eyes, that, she knew that if our older kids weren't going to practice their faith, none of the younger ones would either. And then, all was going to be lost. And so many of our friends said, oh, you can't make them. Oh, well, as long as they're nice people, it's total aberration of understanding what the meaning of life is. When someone gets baptized, they come out of the waters of baptism so that they can actually bring other people to Christ. But we've forgotten that or lost that. And so it was one of those bacon and egg moments. With bacon and eggs, there's the chicken's involved, but the pig's committed. So I was being a chicken with my faith. I was involved, but I wasn't utterly committed. And so as I prayed later that night, thinking, God, what do I need to do for my son to come to know you? And I had this distinct recollection that, I don't hear, sort of this big voice of God, hello, Kevin, this is God speaking. But but I really got the sense that he was saying, let's mess with his head. A few weeks before that, the reading from Matthew where it was talking about the rich man came to Jesus and said, what must I do to receive eternal life? And he said, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to follow the commandments. He goes, tick, 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 tick. Yes, Lord, I've done all these things. Jesus looked at him with a look of love and said, wow, well, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. Like he was calling the apostles, and this guy had the opportunity to be one of the apostles, for eternity. Like what an offer. And he said, oh, I can't do it because he had a lot of money. And for me, I'd spent my life coaching and training people to make a lot of money, to actually make sure they could take care of themselves in retirement, to make sure they could pay for everything. They could retire when they wanted to. They could do all these things. And I was thinking, my goodness, could I let go of everything, or am I trying to serve two masters? And then, of course, the priest gave the homily and said, oh, he didn't really mean that, and he watered the whole thing down. And I was so angry with him because he wasn't challenging me. And he was thinking that what he needed to do was just let us off the hook. So that came to me, and I thought, well, could I do that? And then I sort of imagined, or I heard, God saying, just surrender everything and follow me. Do whatever, say yes to whatever you're asked to do, and he'll see that it's the main course. He'll see that it's the steak, not the potatoes, or not the carrots, or not one of the side orders. It's the real thing. So that night I made a commitment that I was going to divest myself of everything except following the Lord. And I then began that process. I didn't bring my son back to faith. We bribed him and my daughter to go to World Youth Day in Madrid in 2011. Free trip to Europe. Who can say no? But they had to go along with all these religious people and go to Rome and Assisi and then Barcelona and Madrid. And as a result of that, he was he had a huge conversion experience, and now just loves the Lord. And he's I'm so proud of him and the way that he's living his life. And he and his wife are just awesome. They got a little baby girl that he takes to daily mass in their parish in Mornington. And I'm just thinking, wow, the way that he's devoted his whole life, to faith. And so someone else, brought him along. But as a father, children look to their mother for nurture, but they look to their father for character. One of the things you see, like in those old mafia movies, The Godfather and all those sorts of ones, the mum's always going to church, but the dads are out there killing people. And what happens inevitably, the boys kill people. Very few of them become, priests or follow their faith. So what we need is children look to us if I'm going to be living my faith. That's so many people. I haven't got my wife's got more character in her little finger than I've got in my entire body, and yet children look to me for my character. So as a man, I've got to man up. I'm a really big person on fatherhood and the need for fathers to be men. Masculinity is not toxic masculinity. You say toxic masculinity until there's a fire, you look for a fireman, or there's a situation where you get attacked, and then it's a man who runs to the rescue. And so we need to be men that have got character, that are prepared to risk everything to help others. And so my sense was that I really need to turn my life around and so crank things up to a whole notch. So I started giving money away. I made a commitment that I wouldn't earn any more money. And I haven't worked since then. Everything I've done has been pro bono. I've got a few director's fees from a listed company that I'm the chairman of, but then I actually donate that money to a charitable trust. so that it can be to help others. But as I got involved in third world poverty and medical research, all these other things, what became really clear to me was that what's needed is we need to, and I've been asked to be involved in things that are bringing people to faith, bringing people to Jesus. That, in fact, this is the one area where in my lifetime, the last 50 or 60 years, what we've lost our way, and we've forgotten how we exist to evangelize. In Evangelii Gaudium, that encyclical that came out in 2013, we need to all be missionary disciples, and we need to create missionary disciples that can actually disciple others and can multiply and share the good news. Because anything I do here and now is temporary, but what we've got is the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives for a lifetime, and then beyond, for eternity. So that's become the real focus of my life. And I loved being involved in investment. I love being involved in business. I can't help myself. I'm constantly drawn back to it. But the fact is, other than my backsliding, I've actually ended up meeting some of the most extraordinary people around the world. I got involved in a number of church organisations that were run by Protestants, that were non-denominational. But in fact, the Protestants started asking me all the hard questions, like, where's purgatory in the Bible? And I said, it's between the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation, but I'm not quite sure the chapter. But anyway, or the book. But I now know where it is in Corinthians and in the book of Maccabees, and in there's which Martin Luther took out of the Bible. But anyway, it's another subject. But nevertheless, I started learning more and more about my faith, which I didn't know. And then I got involved on the board of Alpha. I was asked to be involved with Alpha, which is a wonderful program to bring people to have an encounter. And one of the things we're lacking in our school system, one of the things we're lacking in all the things we do, is we don't give people an opportunity to encounter the risen Lord. And once you've had an encounter, you can't deny that God exists, that Jesus exists, that it transforms your whole life. And so World Youth Day has been a wonderful initiative of Pope John Paul II to really bring young people to have an encounter with the Lord. Eucharistic adoration gives people an encounter with the Lord. Lots of movements, lots of programs, lots of things that are going on. And so I met a priest who was on the International Board of Alpha, Father James Mallon, who started Divine Renovation. And he wrote a book on how to transform a parish. And the whole essence of the book is to bring hope to priests, life to parishes, and people to Jesus. And I've seen so many priests that are jaded, that have lost their way, that are sick of programs, and they've tried everything, nothing works. So they're just going through the motions. And they've, I spoke to a group of seminarians recently, and I asked these seminarians, I said they're heroic because they know how hard it is, to become a priest, and yet they're doing it anyway. But I said, how many of them are going into the seminary so they can end up having cups of tea with little old ladies? Now, there's nothing wrong with little old ladies, but I'm sure they didn't lay down their life just to go and have cups of tea with little old ladies. But as the church is not rejuvenating, young people going through school don't practice their faith anymore. So our children are not even practicing their faith, and let alone our grandchildren. But then what happens is we've got no adult baptisms. If you've got a parish of 500 people and you have 5 people being baptized at Easter Vigil, congratulations. Everyone in that parish is bringing one person to Jesus per century. Not very good odds. And so what we've got is the demographics are falling off a cliff. And so, what we have to do is we have to, wait in the upper room until power comes from on high, like Jesus said to the apostles. And it's not through our efforts, but we have to pray for the power of the Holy Spirit, for missionary prayer, that we can actually have the courage to, get over our fear of rejection and invite people to come and experience Jesus. And so, what happens is it's the power of the Holy Spirit. We need much, much more leadership training and coaching for priests and lay leaders in the parish, and the very best of leadership. And the third thing we need is to lead with evangelization. Now, most people who get involved in the church are like shepherds. They like to feed my flock, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. But effectively, sheep eat grass. And so if you're going to go be a fisher of men and you put grass on the hook, you're not going to catch many fish. So it's a different charism or a different thing that we need to do. And we're fearful of being fishers of men. So we just look after an ever dwindling number of older and older people. When I was in my 30s, the average age of the Catholic in Australia was 30. Now I'm in my 60s. The average age is about 62 or 63. By the time I get into my 90s, then the average age is going to be 90. And by the time we go over 100 years, we're all gone. Close up the shop, turn out the lights, it's over, Red Rover. So unless we change, the only reason we're surviving at the moment is because of massive number of migrants from Colombia or Sri Lanka or India or the Philippines or Vietnam or Africa. So our churches that are filled and that are vibrant are filled with people who were formed in another place. And what's going to happen is their children are going to get, collided with our culture in Australia. And I can guarantee that within a generation or two, their children won't practice the same as ours don't practice. We've got to change the culture of the Catholic Church in this country and around the world. And so Divine Renovation started with Father James. They were coaching 11 other parishes. And when I got involved, now we're coaching over 1,000 parishes around the world. 5,000 parishes are involved in one way or another. In Australia, and New Zealand, we've got 400 parishes we're working with. We're coaching 100 parishes. And we've got about 10 parishes that are what we call multiplication parishes that are multiplying and helping other parishes and changing. And so it's a big, hairy, audacious goal, but we can bring hope to priests because they can see we can connect them with other priests that are having this extraordinary transformation. We can equip them with all the resources, the coaches, the books, the training, the strength finders, all the things that are needed, and we can inspire them that it doesn't have to be this way. So we can connect, inspire, and equip. We can actually transform their parish, which then transforms their suburb and transforms their neighbouring parishes and changes the whole world, changes our country. And that's what we're called to do. And so that's, we've been entirely donor funded. Literally millions of dollars of donations have enabled us to be supporting priests and their parishes and to bring new life and to really bring a vigor and an excitement and hope and joy to people's lives. And I've gotten involved in another group called the Apostles Fund, which our aim is to raise about $200 million to bring about transformation in parishes right around the world and support groups like Divine Renovation and Life Teens and Catholic Christian Outreach in Canada and some of these other places. I was in France just at the beginning of this month and went to a conference where they're trying to rejuvenate the Christian roots of France. And these people, I met with one of these guys. He's a billionaire who's giving $1 billion to rejuvenate France and $100 million a year for 10 years. And 10% of that is going towards evangelization. So he flew to New York, and one of my colleagues from the Apostles Fund flew down to New York and had lunch with him and talked about what we're doing. And he thought, wow, we need to get Divine Renovation more support in France. We need to get some of these other programs like Life Teens. We need to get things going. Can you work with us in France? So this is happening. And so we think that not only do we get involved in it, but we bring others along. And so ultimately, we could be unlocking $1 billion for the renewal of the church around the world. And that's, it's like, that's worth laying down your life for. It's much better than having cups of tea with little old ladies, I can tell you.
Indeed. The one thing that I experienced growing up, because I had a real zeal and I ended up going overseas to actually meet that need because I couldn't actually find a pathway in Australia. I'd volunteer for charities and it was so bureaucratized that there was no way to actually have any natural interaction with people. And I just heard a story this morning from a fellow down in Victoria. He wanted to mow the lawn of the parish, and the priest said, "Sure, get an ABN and some insurance, and you can do it." And I'm just thinking,
And
what
working
on
with children's check, because you never know when
yeah,
someone's mowing the lawns, they might
and
run over a
and
small child.
so there's this mindset that's crept in, which has completely imprisoned us, where we can't
Yes.
act because of this.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts about that? How in Australia can you possibly break this deadlock to
Yep.
revivify parishes when everyone's too focused on the rule books?
I've thought about it a lot. And in fact, the late Cardinal Pell advised me to, always be faithful to the teaching authority of the church, the magisterium. But, don't necessarily work within the current structures, because they've become moribund or tied up, and it's very difficult. There's so many good people that are working in our schools or working in our diocesan centres or working to make a difference, and they're just so hamstrung. And so, God has prepared each and every one of us. In Ephesians, St. Paul talked about how God's prepared good works for us in advance, so that we can walk in those ways. We've just got to surrender our life and wait on the Lord. We've been, when you look back over your life, every one of us can see, whether it was the time in the SAS or the leadership training, whether it was the time with the East Timorese, whether it was the time with the financial planning, whether it was the money that I was able to accumulate and the skills that I accumulated to invest well and to make money and to. So I need to give, not only when I talked about this man, sell all you have, come follow me, that's the finances. In every parish, people talk about there's no money either that's available. Let's say you've got that parish of 500 people, and most of them in their 60s, 70s or whatever. The average family in a parish, some have got very little, some have got a lot, but on average they've got about $500,000 equity in their home and $500,000 in their retirement savings. So that parish with 500 people has got $500 million sitting in the pews. But they've got other priorities with which to use that money, like having a home to live in and having money that they can spend in their retirement. But if he said that to Peter, stay in Capernaum and have a house to live in and have an income, but he said, no, come follow me. And so what's happening is we rely, on the Lord. What happens is there's no shortage of money. One of my friends once said to me, God doesn't need your money, he needs you. And so the actual act of letting go of my money, which I've been holding on to because I grew up in a really poor household, and I've accumulated. And so what God knew was that I was becoming too attached to that. And so he loves me enough to want me to be in eternity with him. So he's got to unlock. He's doing it for me, telling me to get rid of my money for my sake, not for his, because he doesn't need my money. But in fact, in the act of giving it away, he blesses me even more. So, the thing is, when we see so many institutions in the Australian church, Jesus on the, when he was on the cross, last 7 sayings of Jesus, do you know what those 7 sayings were?
Not off the top of my head. I've heard of them for sure.
Yeah, but I think we think that they are. Be safe. Whatever you do, be safe. Be safe. Be safe. Be safe. Safety is the most important thing. I will scream if I hear a priest during his homily saying safety is the most important thing. During COVID, we were more extreme than our extreme dictator, Daniel Andrews, in closing down churches and denying the sacraments to people because we had to keep everyone safe. And then child safety, after all the pedophilia and all the terrible things that went on, now they've gone overboard with safety. Now they've got bureaucracy about mowing lawns with safety and ticking boxes. And so what happened was I saw, they're trying to change the Catholic education system for my kids to go to a Catholic school was too hard. So God blessed me with lots of financial resources So some families wanted to build a school in Victoria here. So I was able to pour the money in to build a new school. We've got 480 students now. We're getting government grants. And we'll have 1,000 students within the next 5 years, pumping out 100 kids a year that are practicing their faith. The parents are practicing their faith. All the teachers practice their faith, and they've got piety and virtue and character and all the things that you could ever dream of in a Catholic school. And so I'm on the board of this group of people, and so we built our own. And so what happens is when you look at social change in society, the social science says that once you get a tipping point of about 16%, that can transform an entire organization. You can have 2.5% of people that are crazy people who want to change the world, and sometimes they get it right and sometimes they don't. You've got 2.5% of people that no matter what you do, they will fight tooth and nail to keep the status quo. But then if you can get 16% of people on board with change, then the other people start following it and they start coming along. And next thing you know, you can transform the whole culture once you get to 16%. So 16% of all the churches, all the parishes in the world is 33,000 parishes. So our goal at Divine Renovation is to transform 33,000 parishes around the world by 2033, the 2000th anniversary of the start of the church. And that will transform the entire Catholic culture around the world. And so it isn't about safety. Jesus never once said, be safe. In the C.S. Lewis wrote about Aslan, they were saying, talking to Mrs. Beaver, someone said, I hope he's safe. She goes, safe? It's Aslan. He's not safe, but he's good. We don't need to be so caught up in safety, and our infrastructure, our hierarchy have really had that burden put on them to the point where the enemy has crippled all of our institutions, worrying about being safe. And so what's happened is I'm putting all my treasure into taking risk to build a new school, taking risks to transform parishes, taking risks to run things and employ people that can actually make a difference. I've got to give up my time. And so I've also working pro bono now for about 12 years, never earned a penny. So everything that I do, and I work 80 hours a week, pro bono, to helping to make a difference. But I've also got to give my talents and all the skills that I've learned along the way. So time, talent, and treasure, but also my influence. It doesn't start with T, I'm sorry, but the capacity to make a difference and then influence others, to inspire others to say, I can do this too. And so often the whole of history changes, not because of, huge numbers of people, but very few people being prepared to give it a go, to stand up against the tyranny of this cultural Marxism that's swamping our whole society, destroying our young people, stealing our children away from us, and crippling our church institutions so that we can't do anything, making our priests burnt out and dejected and lonely. And so effectively what I'm looking to do is to put the resources and to gather others to put the resources in to make a difference. And I'd like to work somewhere else and go overseas as well, Mark. But the thing is God put me in Victoria, where we've got the crazy Marxist government. God put me in a place of the church. He didn't put me in the vibrant church of Uganda. He didn't put me in this wonderful church of in the Philippines or in other parts of Southeast Asia. He put me in Australia, and at every time when the church is falls into disrepair because we're human. If we look at the Old Testament, constantly the people turned away from God, and then they actually had the Assyrians came and took them off into exile. Then the Babylonians took them off into exile, and then they returned to God. And the prophets, every prophet that told them what they needed to do, they killed them. And so it's a pretty dangerous role to be a prophet, but I've got to be a prophet, and I've got to be an apostle, and I've got to evangelize, and not just be a shepherd and a teacher, which is nice and safe. And so the church has thrived. You know, the blood of the martyr is the seed of the church. It's thrived whenever we've had to lay down our life for our faith. And when we become fat and lazy and complacent, it's the same with families and intergenerational wealth transfer. You know, basically hard times create hard men. And then what happens is good times create soft men and women. And so we've become soft and flabby. We're not match fit. And so what we've got to do is God has placed you and I in a place which seems really tough. But, you know, that's because he loves us so much. He trusts us to actually make a difference. And so St. Francis of Assisi, you know, he heard the voice of God say, rebuild my church. And he starts rebuilding St. Damian's brick upon brick. And God goes, whoa, my goodness, gosh, no, rebuild my church, you know, the whole church. And so he went to Rome and saw the Pope, and then he started rebuilding the church. And I think for every one of us, God is putting on our heart, rebuild my church, the body of Christ, make a difference. And we've got all the answers. You know, we talk about Jordan Peterson. He's searching and he's saying the Catholic Church is, you know, if it wasn't true, it wasn't real, you know, we'd have to invent it, because it is by far the most logical answer to everything that's gone on in our history and our society. And so our faith gives the answers to young people. And they're in, you know, we've got more youth suicide, we've got more despair, we've got more, you know, frustration and broken marriages and all sorts of problems, not because we don't know what to do, it's because we haven't shared our faith with them. We haven't shared Jesus. So Jesus and the truth is a person.
Yeah.
And what happens is when people give their life away, it transforms them and makes them whole and makes them, you know, renewed. And so God's got plenty of money. We just got to unlock it, and we've just got to stop holding on to it. He's got plenty of people. You know, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And we need to volunteer. We need to actually say, yes, I'll be a laborer. Instead of me chasing after having the right postcard and the right car to drive and all those sorts of things, he's basically saying to us, you don't need any of that stuff. And what's interesting for me is I was like a type A personality. I wanted to be running everything, but everything he's got me involved in the last 12 years, whether it's Alpha, which Nicky Gumbel is the big guru who started it, whether it's the school that I'm involved in, I didn't start it, I came in behind them. Whether it's Divine Renovation and Father James is the guy who started, whether it's the Apostles Fund and Michael from Canada started everything that I've become involved in, I'm in a supporting role. And that's because God wants me to spend eternity with him. And he knows that pride and me thinking it's all about me is going to get in the way of me being with him. And he loves me too much to let that happen. So I'm very grateful for turning from rooster to feather duster and humbling me to just be a bit player and a support player in the great story of his story. History is his story, and bringing people to him is the most, you know, exciting adventure and dynamic opportunity that each and every one of us has been given, like that rich man in the Bible when he was calling him to come and follow him. And when we start doing that, the world changes. But in Australia, as in a lot of the West and in Europe, we've stopped believing in what we know to be the truth, and we've got to proclaim it, and we've got to proclaim it loudly, instead of, you know, being like the daily mass goers. You know, they were social distancing for 20 years before COVID came along, and very holy people all sitting there but not talking to anyone else or not sharing their faith with anybody. We've got to be out there and we've got to be proclaiming it, and but we're too frightened. I know I'm too frightened to talk to my next door neighbour or talk to the person down the street, or, you know, to invite someone to come back in. And it's easy when I can do a podcast with you, but try doing it when you've got a few mates around for a beer from the neighbourhood, and you don't want to be weird, you know. And so, you know, the fact is we've got to take all these safety nets we put around us and just be bold and proclaim what gives us the joy in our life and what gives us the hope.
Yeah. I think the safetyism is a big part of the problem, because I think growing up in Catholic school and going to my regular parish, Jesus was always really, really safe and boring and embarrassing. And the thing is,
We've made him safe.
well, exactly, we've made him safe. But when it all came alive for me was kind of setting off into the deep, taking that step off the ledge.
Hey, you know what? I love a saying, Mark, a ship in the harbour is safe,
Hmm.
but that's not what ships were built for.
No.
It will never sink when you leave it in the harbour, but it's got to go out and do what it was built
Hmm.
for, and it's got to take risk, and risk and reward are related, and we've got to do that. And like Jesus died on the cross, he showed us the cross. We look at a crucifix, we forget how horrific this torture instrument was,
Hmm.
and all the apostles except John were tortured and martyred, and so throughout the whole of history. We've not been safe. But the fact is that we don't need to be safe. And in fact, safety is what really gets my goat.
Hmm.
And so I'm basically a free agent. I'm able to work wherever I am needed, or to do whatever I need to do, and stop thinking that we've just got to work within the parameters of some of these institutions. And we're in the hard places, and we've got to basically have iron sharpening iron,
Yeah.
and supporting each other.
I think that's the problem we have with young men, though, is that men don't see Jesus or the faith as a challenge, and
Oh yes, it
it's
is.
actually having them take a risk, like a risk taking culture, is where boys will be attracted to and where they'll perform. Um,
Yeah, that's why I
but
said to the seminarians, "Did you join the seminary to have cups of tea with little old ladies?"
mm,
Um, and as we get more inward focused, we don't get anyone else, and we just grow old together, and so we're going in and up in age. We need to
mm,
go down in age and out into the community. So we need to be down and out, and that's
yeah,
risky. And
mhm,
and so why did all those young guys sign up for Gallipoli in 1915? They wanted to lay down their life for something greater than themselves. If you ever go to an Anzac Day march, why do these old guys march together? They're remembering a time when they might have been accountants or bakers or factory workers, but there was one period of their life where they were prepared to lay down their life for their mates and for their
mm,
country and for their guide, and for things that were different than the normal everyday things. And the romance of our faith is unbelievable. The romance of a priest when he's got oil on his hands, he's newly ordained, he's going to change the world, and then he gets jaded. We've got to
mm,
bring back that romance, and the romance of and I've seen it with my kids, and I know for myself, when you first fall in love as a teenager, you change from being a selfish little brat that's 15 or 16 or 17, and suddenly you want to live your whole life for this goddess, this wonderful creature that you do anything for, and that's it's just so wonderful that you can actually experience that there's something bigger than yourself, and yet we
mm,
try to tell people, and we dish up such a cold, sickly soup that no one would ever want to eat it, and
mm,
so we are constantly watering down things so that in a parish or a school, we give them just enough religion to inoculate them against the real thing. So they'll
mm.
never, ever catch the real thing. We need to have more people catching the Jesus virus, and we need to spread it across the whole world. And no inoculation is going to actually protect anyone against it. It's not safe.
Indeed. And so, what advice would you give to young men who don't feel they have a purpose in life, and what challenges should they set themselves, do you think? Because you went to the army at 16, you joined the SAS, you joined the ski team, you've gone hard every point in your life.
Yeah.
Um, what advice can you give to those who are at home playing video games, afraid of asking a girl out?
Who dares wins.
SAS motto.
That's our motto. Who dares wins.
Mm,
You could say who cares who wins, but I care.
hmm,
And if they care, then, life, Helen Keller said she was deaf, dumb, and blind. And someone was able to break through that darkness and teach her how to read with Braille and all sorts of things. But her famous quote was that life is a daring adventure or nothing at all. Get off your fat ass and start having an adventure. Because what happens is, you just become a blob, and that's not much fun. You've got to risk it all, and make a difference. And what's the worst thing that could happen? You're dead a long time, and so just confront fears every time. When I was a skier, or anything that I was doing, if I found that I was frightened of something, I knew that I had to throw myself into it and confront the fear. And the exhilaration of overcoming fear is extraordinary. So, what we need is a heck of a lot more kick-ass Christianity. That's the sort of Christianity that's masculine for us men and feminine like our Blessed Mother. That women, can understand true femininity by following our Blessed Mother. And true masculinity by Jesus, the most masculine man there was, that took massive risks and was prepared to do what many of us would be terrified to do. And quite frankly, I think Patrick Coffin says, be a saint. What else is there? There's no other alternative. We're either going to be saints or damned for eternity in hell. There's no middle ground. That ultimately I want to be a saint, and we're frightened to say, why don't we admit it? Say yes. Well, we know what we need to do to be a saint. We need to get off all those things that addict us and all those things that cause us laziness. So many people, imagine losing the faith because you're lazy. Imagine losing the opportunity to play a grand final in the sport that you love because you're lazy. Too lazy to do the training, too lazy to care. And so the enemy is basically getting in our ear and destroying us. The enemy is out there and destroying our society, destroying our community, destroying our way of life, and making us fat and lazy and wanting everything now. And so, I want to do something that's worthwhile. I want to change the world. I want to be able to live life to the full. And I'm sure in the heart of every young person is that desire to be real, to have purpose, to have meaning. Meaning comes from letting go of your own selfishness and your own desires. Marriage is not about having someone meet my needs. It's about me sacrificing. Christopher West talks about marriage. Jesus talks about a woman, submit yourself to your husband. And the girls go, ah! But then he says, husbands, basically he asks the husbands to love your wife like Christ loved the church. And so it's the marriage bed of the cross where Jesus gave everything for his bride, the church. He laid down his life. Now, if you're going to lay down your life as a husband, then I'm not sure I would ever meet any wife that wouldn't want to submit herself to that mission, where he's going to lay down his life for you and your children. And so they're the two sides of what makes a great marriage. And so, we've got to have good leadership. We've got to have young people that are rising to that task of leadership, that are going to kick ass, that are going to, not be lazy, that are going to dare to dream, to dare to live the way that they were created to live, that God has prepared something in advance for every one of us. And we've got to live that and live it to the full. And our life will be so filled with joy, so filled with purpose, so filled with meaning that we won't be able to scratch ourselves.
Speaking of becoming saints, that brings us to our last question, which is, who is your favorite saint and why?
John Paul II. I met him in 1978 when he'd only been Pope for about 30 or 40 days. And he was just awesome. He'd lost his mother. He would wake up in the middle of the night and see his father praying. He lived through Nazi Germany and went into seminary during the time of the Nazis and went through incredible suffering. And then he lived under this massive persecution. And he was always devoted to our Blessed Mother and always devoted to Jesus. And he was courageous when he was the Archbishop of Krakow. And when they built Nova Huta, the new town, the new city just outside of Krakow. And he continually when people were being killed, murdered as priests, he continually was smart and focused. And then when he became Pope, he had an amazing devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and prayer. And he went out and put himself out on a limb and was prepared to go wherever they went. I loved him in 1989 when he visited Timor for the first time, and he knelt to kiss the ground because he was going to a new country, even though it was considered a province of Indonesia. So he was speaking without speaking, that he believed this was a separate country, and gave them the courage to fight for independence. He continually, even when he was suffering from Parkinson's, but he just had an inner peace and a joy and a capacity and a love of young people to share the faith to his dying breath, and so my sense is that he was just, a saint that I met originally and talked to him in 1978. I met him when he came to Perth briefly in 1986. I saw him a few times, but I met him that first time as an 18-year-old, and he made a big impression on me. I love Mother Teresa because she just gave up everything and just, wow, what an example. When she has on the wall of all of her convents, I thirst, and one of the things, the 7 things that Jesus really did say on the cross, but he was thirsting for us, yearning for me, yearning for you. I thirst, that's, a great marriage when you just desire to be with the other person. It's just such a wonderful microcosm of what God just desires to be with us. He loves us. He thirsts for us. And, Pier Giorgio Frassati, is a blessed, but, just, reach for the heights, prepared. Like there's so many great saints, but John Paul II, I think, probably would be someone that is a saint for our times. I love Carlos Acutis, who's just been canonized, and the idea that the Eucharist and bring a young guy, to share his faith with his friends. Pier Giorgio, when the fascists were in Italy in the early 20s, and then, but he just, and he was out helping the poor and making a difference and being humble. There's Francis of Assisi, amazing. St. Paul, where he's prepared to proclaim, boldly. Rome was the most dangerous place to go. A bit like Beijing today, or Pyongyang in North Korea. Would you or I be prepared to go there? Paul went there, and he died there. But that's when, that's why we've got to stop being safe. That's why young men will answer the call and join the army and go off and be prepared to defend what they believe in. That's what we've got to be girding our loins, because what's going to be happening in the next 10 or 20 years is going to be persecution in all sorts of ways. I reckon George Pell might be a saint, I think somehow he could be in heaven, and I'd love to see him canonized. When he said, "Be not afraid," he wrote that great book, "Be Not Afraid." And so that's the sort of leadership that we need to have, even when all your peers disagree with you. Keeping your eye on the goal, keeping focused on what needs to be done, and being prayerful, and really following that calling. And life is a daring adventure, and do not accept the second-rate claptrap that the world seems to be delivering up. And it's about time we got courageous and got out there and started being prepared to face our fears and make a difference. We might be surprised.
Yeah,
fight!
Australia shouldn't settle for having one canonized saint.
No, we
Finally,
shouldn't.
Kevin, how can people support your work? What links or places can they visit to see what you're up to?
We are getting matching funding for Divine Renovation. A very generous donor has said if we can collect up to $400,000 by the end of next year, they'll match us dollar for dollar. So you can go on the divinerenovation.org website and you can make a donation to Divine Renovation. That would be the best help, because that's the big thing we've got to get is 400. He won't let me donate either. He said, I've got to get other people donating other than you, Kevin, because I'll put the buddy money in and get the extra 400. So we can turn that 400,000 into 800,000. But I can't do it because I'm not allowed to. I've got to donate, but I'm not getting any benefit from it. But other people, that's how they could really make a difference. And support your local parish and your local parish priest, and put strings on it. Say, hey, I want to put this money in. I want to make a difference. I want to put some money in to build a adoration chapel in my local parish, so that we can actually have 24/7 adoration. There's so many things that they can do, but the way that they could help me would be to help Divine Renovation in this time when we need to collect in the next 15 months $400,000. So $1,000 becomes $2,000 when they'll be matching that funding. Yeah.
All right, well, if you're watching, you know what to do. Just a small plug for the Thomas More Centre. If you could like, share, and subscribe to our channel, that will help us get up to the magic 1,000 that we would appreciate getting to as our next goal. Also, if you want to read an interesting newsletter that comes out every week, usually on a Wednesday, tmc.org.au, just sign up there. And likewise, we have events mostly across the Eastern Seaboard. I'm up in Brisbane. So if you're watching and you want to come and say hello at one of our events, please do. It'll be great to hear from you. Kevin Bailey joining us from Victoria in Australia. Thanks so much for your time.
Good on you, Mark. Thank you.